Azure AI services require communication endpoints to facilitate interactions between your application and the AI models. Endpoints are access points that allow services to be consumed over the network. Selecting appropriate endpoints directly influences your solution's performance, availability, and reliability. Hence, identifying the default endpoint is crucial, offering a straightforward, standardized option for immediate use after service provisioning, without additional configurations. Endpoints in Azure are network locations that expose services to clients. Each AI resource provisioned in Azure has associated endpoints that are URL-based and follow a predictable format. Default Azure endpoints commonly adhere to a standardized naming convention: https resource name, location, api.cognitive.microsoft.com. These endpoints provide easy initial connectivity to services without specialized configuration, making them essential for prototyping and development phases. Using the default endpoint provided by Azure has several practical advantages, including immediate availability after resource deployment. No need for custom network configuration initially. Simplified development and testing purposes. Common and predictable structure, enhancing maintainability. This simplifies the learning curve and accelerates the development lifecycle, enabling focus on functionality and service utilization rather than complexity in initial setup and configurations. To identify the default endpoint for an Azure AI service, follow these steps. Log into the Azure portal. Navigate to the AI resource created, Cognitive Service or Azure AI Service. Click on the Overview section. Default endpoint appears prominently in the resource details. Alternatively, you can use Azure CLI or PowerShell commands to retrieve endpoint details programmatically. Access your default AI endpoint via Azure Portal. Sign in to Azure Portal. Navigate to specific AI resource created under the All Resources tab. Once selected, the default endpoint appears under the Overview or Keys and Endpoint section. This endpoint is available immediately after resource creation, simplifying integration with AI solutions and reducing initial setup efforts significantly. Retrieve the endpoint using Azure CLI commands. Bash AZ Cognitive Services account show / name, your service name / resource group, your resource group / query endpoint / output TSV. This efficient approach allows automation, scripting, and integration into continuous integration and deployment pipelines, facilitating management and scalability operations. Use Azure PowerShell script to obtain the endpoint. PowerShell get his Cognitive Services account. Resource group name, your resource group. Name, your service name. Select object. Expand property endpoint. These command-driven interfaces enable highly efficient and repeatable deployments, streamlining DevOps tasks with Azure. Default endpoints are commonly integrated into applications via environment variables or configuration files. For example, in .NET, you may define endpoints in configuration like JSON Azure Service endpoint, https://your-service-endpoint, API key, your account key. This approach promotes flexibility, allowing easy updates or switches between environments, development, testing, production. Using default Azure endpoints necessitates appropriate authentication methods, typically API keys or Azure Active Directory authentication. API keys are most common in initial deployments. API key inclusion in request headers. HTTP, OCPP, and subscription key. Your key here, implementing effective authentication ensures endpoint security, preventing unauthorized usage or service exploitation. Azure AI includes default endpoints tailored to specific areas or regions. Common examples include Service Default Endpoint Format example, Computer Vision Resource Name .cognitive services.azure.com vision-resource.cognitive services.azure.com Language Service Resource Name .cognitive services.azure.com Text-resource .cognitive services.azure.com. You can directly apply these endpoints in your code, facilitating straightforward access to Azure cognitive capabilities. For global solutions, Azure services may require region-specific endpoints to reduce latency and comply with data residency requirements. Hence, choosing endpoints within the user's proximity significantly impacts performance and user satisfaction. Use Azure Traffic Manager or Azure Front Door to manage multiple endpoints globally, directing user requests to the closest or best performing location effectively. Azure Resource Manager templates offer a structured way to manage Azure AI services and endpoints declaratively. Endpoint management example: JSON outputs, endpoint type, string, value, reference, resource ID, Microsoft.cognitive services/accounts, parameters, account name, April 18th, 2017, properties endpoint. ARM templates facilitate infrastructure as code, automating service deployment and ensuring consistency across various environments. Consider the following best practices for endpoint management. Use default endpoints initially, then transition to custom domain endpoints during scaling. Implement API management layers to monitor, secure, and optimize usage. Regularly audit and rotate API keys for enhanced security. Employ failover mechanisms and endpoint redundancy for enhanced reliability. Following these practices enhances application scalability, reliability, and security.